Having a ghost haunting your home is a terrifying thing to think about. But having a ghost haunting your home that is more afraid than you are, may be even more terrifying. What could have it so scared? In today's video, I will be telling 3 stories from No Sleep. A huge thank you to the writers. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you enjoy the video, a like and a comment is always appreciated. Subscribing if you're new is as well. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I never expected to be haunted. I suppose no one ever really does. I just always figured that if something like this were to happen to me, I'd at least have some kind of idea it might. Some sort of red flag. Like moving into a really old house, disturbing a burial ground, someone cursing me with their dying breath. I didn't get anything like that. I mean, I did move into a new place, sure, but it wasn't old. Or even a house for that matter. I moved into a new apartment in the city. The building itself had only been finished a month prior. Nothing had ever lied in the apartment before me, and I was one of the first people in the whole building for that matter. How could I ever have expected a place like this to be haunted? For the record, no, this is not just a case of the new place jitters. Neither is it a "I've got a bad feeling" or a "stuff moving on its own" kind of thing. It's an actual full-on visible ghost, or spirit, or whatever you want to call it. And I saw it the first time I stepped through my front door. It was move-in day. I'd done an apartment viewing before moving in, of course, but not the actual apartment I'd be living in. I suppose that could have come off as suspicious, especially now, with what I know about the place. However, I just figured the building manager didn't want to have to go all the way up to the 10th floor. The floor plan of the one I viewed was exactly the same anyway, so I didn't bother making a fuss. So there I was, carrying my first box into the new place. And the first thing I see after opening the door into my dim, unlit apartment is a shadowy figure huddling in the corner. My first thought was that it was a burglar, but why break into an empty apartment? I hesitantly flicked the light switch on, and saw that it was a little girl, maybe around 10 years old, crouched and shaking in the corner. I was confused for a moment, but then I noticed her clothes. A t-shirt and some jeans. A normal sort of outfit for a young girl, but terribly dirty and torn. I figured that she must have been homeless, squatting in an empty apartment to get out of the cold of the coming winter. I was perplexed as to how she had managed to sneak past security, but ultimately just shrugged it off. I approached her, still cowering in the corner. She was shaking like a leaf in apparent fear, her arms wrapped around her head. I felt awful for her, and looking at how skinny and malnourished she seemed, figured I could get her a meal or something before I called CPS. I reached out to her still quivering shoulder, planning on giving it a gentle shake and letting her know I wasn't upset or going to hurt her. When I touched her shoulder though, I immediately recoiled, surprised at how cold she was. It was like touching a block of dry ice, so cold it burned. She stopped trembling at my touch and began to turn ever so slowly to face me, almost like she was afraid to look. When our gazes met though, we both screamed. First her, then me shortly after. Her eyes had been clawed out, roughly, as if by an animal. The girl ran off farther into the apartment, and I quickly went the other way, rushing back out the front door and slamming it behind me. I immediately called the building manager, telling him that there was a strange little girl in my apartment. I didn't tell him about the eyes though, worried that he might think I was crazy and ignore me if I did. Besides, it wasn't like he couldn't see for himself when he came up. However, when he got there and searched the place from top to bottom, we couldn't manage to find her. My building manager decided that she must have slipped out. I reluctantly agreed, doubting that she was able to be that sneaky with her eyes like that. I hadn't exactly considered the possibility of her being a ghost yet, though the thought did occur to me. The idea of it seemed silly, at first. However, when I turned away from the front door, just after saying goodbye to my building manager, and found her cowering in the corner once more, I quickly changed my mind. I was so scared of her at first. I mean, who wouldn't be? She was an actual ghost. However, it's sort of hard to stay scared of a ghost who seems so scared herself. And when I say scared, I mean absolutely terrified, literally all the time. Other than the corner where I saw her the first time, She has a couple of other hiding spots throughout the apartment, where she'll randomly appear. Under the shelves in the pantry, behind the shower curtain, in the hall closet. She even started hiding under the bed after I finally got the frame set up. That time was a special sort of surprise, as she started screaming as soon as I laid down. I considered moving away at first, but ultimately decided not to. Other than startling me every now and then, she seemed absolutely harmless. Unless I tried to get her attention or disturb her in some way, she wouldn't do anything but sit there and tremble. It didn't really seem like something worth breaking my lease over, you know? It's a really nice apartment too, and I would have hated to lose it. I've spent some time since trying to figure out where she came from. I felt really bad for her. She was so young. And those wounds to her eyes, her death couldn't have been an easy one. I thought that, if I knew more about her, maybe I would be able to help her. Plus I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little worried about why she was scared all the time. In spite of my efforts though, I couldn't seem to find any sort of information on her in the slightest. It was a bit odd, seeing as you'd think a death like hers would somehow stand out. Perhaps her body was never found. It's hard to say. Either way, with nothing but dead ends to work with, I simply decided to just let it be. I've had worse living roommates, so I could learn to deal with the little inconveniences of living in a haunted apartment. I wouldn't have even bothered posting anything here, if not for recent developments. Now, I wish I had moved out when I had the chance. A few days ago, a large section of that white popcorn ceiling stuff fell off, revealing what looked to be an attic door. It was made of dark, heavy wood, and had a tarnished brass ring for a handle. It makes no sense for it to be there though, of course, considering the fact that I live in an apartment building, with nothing above me but another apartment. I tried getting it to open, but it seemed to be locked or something. If there was a way of unlocking it though, it must have been on the other side, as I couldn't see any locking mechanism on mine. I tried to call to the building manager about it, but he didn't answer the phone. I tried to go down and see him at the main office on the ground floor, but it was completely empty with no sign of anyone having been there for some time. I even tried knocking on the door to the apartment just above mine on the 11th floor. However, nobody ever answered the multiple times I tried, so I just assumed it was one of the unoccupied ones. This event started me thinking about all the other odd things I had noticed about the building. Things that I had brushed off before, but now seemed to be neon signs telling me something was up. You see, I shouldn't be the only one living here, yet I've never once ran into any of the other residents. It's not just that though, nobody I've mentioned my building to has ever even heard of the place. I was able to find public records on the building when I looked, but still. The city isn't exactly all that big, and new buildings are far from common. I talked to a lot of people at libraries and such when I was trying to find out information on the little girl, and none of them had even heard about it. I initially wrote it off as an odd coincidence, but seriously, how could that be? Even in spite of this, I didn't feel like I needed to leave. Besides, with my building manager having seemingly vanished, it wasn't like I could get a hold of the paperwork to properly move anyway. It wasn't until today though that I realized that, since the attic door had appeared, I hadn't seen the ghost of the little girl even once. By then though, it was far too late. This morning, I woke up to the sound of the attic door rattling like crazy, the sound of the brass handle smacking over and over against the wood like a frantic victim trying to escape. I peeked out of my bedroom just once, but I didn't look long. The moment I stuck my head out the door, the shaking stopped, and I heard the distinct sound of a latch being unlocked. I don't know why, but I immediately got the feeling I didn't want to see what was coming through. I slammed my bedroom door shut and locked it, hastily pushing a couple shelves in front of it as a makeshift barricade. I wish now that I had made a break for the front door, but it's too late now either way. Who knows if I would have made it out anyway. I heard the attic door open shortly after I finished pushing the last shelf into place. Since then, I've heard nothing. Not a single sound from either inside or outside the apartment. Not a car horn, a bird call, or even the sound of wind. Just nothing. It's been hours now, and I still can't hear anything but a completely dead silence. My bedroom doesn't even have a single window, so I have no way of checking what's going on outside. I've tried to call for help on my phone, but I can't seem to get a cell signal. Weirdly enough, I have Wi-Fi, but nobody has responded to my emails either. Not my friends or family members, my building manager, or anybody. It's funny. As I'm writing this, I just realized I have no idea what my building manager even looks like, even though I've seen him face to face and talked to him multiple times. Maybe he never even existed. Who knows at this point? I think I'm probably going to try and make a break for it. I could try and wait whatever this is out, but I have no guarantee that this will ever end. When I think back on the gaunt figure of the ghost of that poor little girl, I find myself wondering how long she might have waited for. I want to give this a try before I lose any strength. At least I'll feel like I have a slightly better chance this way. I don't know if anyone will ever read this. If my other attempts at communication are any indication, then probably not. However, if this somehow manages to actually get posted, can you please do me a favor? If somebody on here ever happens to post about their apartment being haunted by the ghost of a woman with their eyes scratched out, please tell them to get out while they can. It all started after I was watching these exploration YouTube videos. The things they'd search through are terrifying. That's why I put myself through the worst experience imaginable, because it looks so easy. There's an old abandoned sewer in my town about 5 miles from where I live. The city used it for an old town near a mine, but no one works there anymore. I know what you're thinking. Why not go to the abandoned mine, or the old town? Well, that's because I was an idiot, and wanted to do something no one has ever done before, so I picked a sewer. The ride there wasn't that bad. Actually, things were going pretty well. I was super excited I had a backpack filled with snacks, water, flashlights, batteries, a camera, and a gun. I wasn't supposed to take the gun. It was my dad's, but I wanted to be safe, and I knew how to use it. I arrived at the sewer entrance at around 1 in the afternoon. The part of the sewer I was entering was like a big half circle, in the ground about as wide as a car. It was like a long tube leading to God knows where. Hopefully to something cool, I thought. The first thing I noticed about the sewer was the smell. It was god-awful. It smelled like crap, fish, and dead animals, all put in a blender, and flung all over the place. It was so bad I pulled the strings on my sweatshirt hood and tied them to cover my nose. As I pressed on into the sewer, I turned on my flashlight and camera. I didn't really know what to do other than make a few comments and walk deeper into the sewer. The sewer was dark, wet, and a little cold. It began to get a little skinnier as I went along, about the width of my arm span now. As I was walking, I noticed little holes in the walls of the sewer, about the size of a quarter or a nickel. When I looked into the holes, I found that they weren't very deep, and had something shiny at the back, like a copper color. The water in the sewer began to rise the farther I went. I knew this could happen, so I wore boots, but it was almost above my ankle. As I was walking, however, I saw something floating in the water. When I picked it up, I realized it was a clipboard. The clipboard was badly damaged, almost in tatters, but I could make out the words specimen and active. Then towards the bottom I saw obtain samples and capture. I thought it was cool and recorded it with my camera. I started talking to my audience, explaining how I thought this could be something important. Eventually, while walking, I heard a loud splash about 15 feet away, from deeper in the tunnel. I jumped so hard I dropped my camera, and instantly knew I had messed up. I tried searching around in the now shin-high water. I felt relieved when my fingers hit something in the water. I picked it up and realized that I was holding a bone, with some sort of yellow rubber loosely attached to it. I flung the bone, but as I was backing up I tripped on something below my feet in the water. I fell backwards into the cold water, and sat on something hard. It crunched under my weight, but floated up to the surface. Bobbing in the water now was a body in a yellow suit with a mask. I screamed louder than I wanted to, and heard a splash again somewhere in the tunnel. I grabbed my flashlight and looked around, and realized in my fear and confusion I had gotten lost. I was in some sort of 4-way tunnel in the sewer, with a body and something splashing around. I reached in my bag for my dad's gun, an old 1911 from his service days. I knew by heart it only had 7 rounds, so I was not to waste the ammo. Shaking, I walked over to the tunnel I thought I had come through. The tunnel got wider and wider, until it was the size of a room. I walked deeper and realized there were bodies floating everywhere. There had to be at least 6 all torn open and all wearing that same yellow suit. I began to cry. I moved over to one of the bodies and saw an American flag and some sort of insignia I had never seen before. Around him was an MP5K strapped around his lifeless body. On his forearm was some type of tactical playbook, like what football players have on their arms sometimes, but more military. I stripped it off and read the first line. March 7th, 2002. This was 11 years ago. I remember whispering to myself. At that moment, I heard an ear-splitting shriek. I dropped the armband and turned around. My flashlight shined on a monstrosity. This thing had a face like a lizard and scales. That's all I saw before it whipped to the side, with what I think now was its tail. I flew across the sewer and hit the wall, but still managing to hold my dad's gun. I squeezed off 2 rounds in its general direction, but I could hear it running towards me. Splash, splash. I flung my book bag into its direction and ran as fast as I could. As I ran, I stumbled over bloated bodies and weapons. My flashlight swinging wildly revealed flashes of bloodstains on walls and torn yellow suits. I heard it screech again and felt its claws rake the back of my arm. I cried out in pain and could feel hot blood run down my hand. I whipped around and pulled the trigger 2 more times. The first round missing, but the second one must have hit because I heard a terrible scream. It jumped up into a hole in the sewer wall and disappeared. I kept running. My flashlight showed endless sewer. Left sewer, right sewer, forward sewer. It all flashed behind me, in a blur as I stomped and sprinted my way through the sewer. Splashes of water soaking my back and pants with each kick. Once again, I tripped and fell into the sewer water. My boots filled with water, and I began to sink. My mind was racing, trying to figure out where I had just fallen. I had dropped my father's gun, but I had gripped my flashlight tightly. I started swimming up towards the surface. As I was swimming, I swear I saw through the murky water another dead man. The only thing recognizable was the top right part of his face. I came to a ledge and pulled myself up. I started sobbing. I was lost, freezing, and terrified of everything that I had seen. As I was sitting there, I felt my entire body yanked backwards. It felt like I was being pulled through the smallest crack in the world. My shoulders popped and cracked, and intense pain filled my entire body. White hot seared through my brain as I wriggled and screamed in pain. Either the wall was gonna break, or I was, and this creature couldn't care less. I whipped my legs over my head like an animal and kicked as hard as I could, as if I was doing a backflip. My left foot impacted into the creature, and as it cried out, I swear I could hear its anger. It let go of me and I ran down the sewer. It sloped downwards. I began to see a dim light. A light at the end of the tunnel. I remember laughing as I thought this. I ran out of the sewer and eventually found my car. It was around 5 p.m. when I finally found it. After my interview with this man, he showed me a long claw-like scar on the back of his arm. He also showed me his shoulder blades had a faint but noticeable scar on each side. I don't usually believe these types of cases, but he seems genuine. He also told me that after 7 years, he will be returning to the tunnel in a few days. He also told me he will share his story if he returns. Stay safe as always. I've spent more time in the 77th Street Diner than I had in my own office at some point last year. I know all the waitresses by name in each shift. I know the menu backward and forwards. I've heard every song on the jukebox. Yet I can't find myself to leave the red corner booth, with a hole in the leather just underneath my thigh. I always dug my fingers into the plush beneath. Everyone in the force understood why I sat in the diner so often. It seemed to be the only connection I could make between 5 missing girl cases. For background information, I live in a small town. The cliché type of small town that most people talk about in true crime cases on the news, where nothing happens in them. It's true for us. We hadn't had a single murder since 1876. It's on record in our police archives. There aren't robberies, no runaways, no murders, nothing gruesome. The worst that happens is a person driving through speeding too fast, or kids when they skip school to drink underage or their tractor parties in the middle of cornfields. 5 missing girls are outrageous. People in our little town have definitely given the station heat, and I think it's deserved. The only connection I can make between all 5 girls is they're in high school, and they all come to this diner. I can't find myself to leave even though I've closed the case by now. I still think about them, know their case number still like they're tattoos on my skin. Misty, Joanna, Eden, Corinne, and Lisa all went missing starting on April 28th. I remember when I got the call about it, how I rushed to the scene. Misty's mother was a wreck, of course she was. Misty was her only daughter. My partner wanted to pin it as a runaway, right out of the gates, so it wouldn't be that big of a problem, but I knew who this girl was. Everyone knew who everyone was in this town. Misty was a straight-A student with ambition, a future. I knew the drunks in this town and her parents didn't add up to the reputation. The last time she was seen was exiting the 77th Street Diner by Irene. Irene is the kindest woman I have ever met who runs the diner. She closes every single night and always asks me to walk her out to her car. On the CCTV footage that records all day and night, it checks out that Irene saw Misty leave. Misty had a coffee that night, as she had her notebook unfurled on the table. Sitting in the booth I now claim as my own. Irene went to the back and spent 2 hours counting the money, doing an inventory check, and browsing the internet. Misty was last seen that night at 10 p.m., never to be seen again like she vanished from thin air. It was then I sat in the diner and people watched. It was always the same people who came in at the same time, until school released. The variations of who came and who didn't would change as the days went by. I had my team searching everywhere we could that didn't require a warrant. There was nothing outside the diner, not a single splotch of evidence. The last time her phone met a cell phone tower was in the diner. It felt like she fell off the face of the earth. The circumstances for the other girls was the same. May 5th, Joanna went missing as she left the diner at 9:47 p.m. Last spotted by Jonathan and his wife Penelope as they were entering a bar across the street. Their words were they saw her walking, and once they looked back, she was gone. There was no evidence. Her cell phone last pinged a tower there. She disappeared as well. May 18th is when Eden went missing at 7:14 p.m. as she was leaving the diner. Her waitress closed her tab at 7:14. No one saw Eden leave, so that was our closest guess. Eden was always a quiet one, who had a loud home life since her mother had children with all different kinds of men, and being the oldest, she watched them all. Her friends recounted that she would have to study at the diner when she could get a chance, since her house was so loud and she could never get out once the library was closed. Our town is too small to study anywhere else. Like the others, she vanished from thin air. Corinne was a break in the case since someone did see her, and someone saw a man following her. Her waitress saw her leaving on the phone on June 2nd, and everyone knew in the town by now she was on the phone with her boyfriend. Jeffrey and Corinne were usually inseparable, but we gathered as we sat at a family dinner at his grandparents in the town over. They were talking when he was riding home. The whole family was used to them talking all the time. Corinne left the diner at 8:15 p.m. after catching herself some dinner since her parents were always working. It was known she'd always go out to eat. Many eyewitnesses saw her on the phone with a man in all black and all black hat to shield his face, as many described. He was taller than Corinne, but had a hunch to his back, so we theorized he was older. Her phone was also left shattered on the concrete at the scene, but besides that, she was gone too. Lisa was the most recent one. She left the diner at 7:30 p.m. on June 22nd, and unlike Corinne, she was like the others, gone without a trace. Only her waitress saw her leave. Nothing was left at the scene, and the town was sent into a frenzy. A deserved one. The heat on our small police force was increasing. People were no help, though. Not because they didn't see anything, but they gave us threats to rid us of our positions, so no one could solve the case. For a while, I was out on the field. I looked everywhere I could with my team, but around the time when Corinne went missing, I noticed the connection was the diner. I had to get in the mind of the culprit. I figured he did people watching. So I became one with the diner, and watched people. Watched to see if an old man came in with a hunch to the place. I probably scared him off, once I sat there every day constantly, when Lisa came since no other girl went missing. My profiling was right. He was using the place to scout for his victims. The only other things I could gather about the diner was that the girls came there almost weekly before they went missing. It would have given enough time for the suspect to watch them and memorize a schedule, how they act, if they're vigilant, etc. My only lead was Corinne's case, since hers was the messiest. The one with the most witnesses who could provide what the man looked like, and yet, Corinne's parents provided little to no help. They knew nothing about their daughter's life, workaholics who were so detached from their daughter's life. They didn't even know about the number of colleges interested in her, how she was going to get out of this small town. I get so frustrated when I think about this case, because every other family couldn't help. There was nothing to work with, and everything was seemingly normal with their daughters. Eden's mother even knew what she was doing when she was out. She gave the approval for her to leave the house. The one lead we had was stumped by horrible parenting. The hopelessness I felt when it came around a week after Lisa went missing. But it turns out I was looking for the wrong source. There was someone who knew every single thing about Corinne, and it was Jeffrey. Jeffrey came to find me in the diner one night, just a week after Lisa sat down across from me. The kid looked miserable. Black hair looked greasy with bags underneath his blue eyes that held so much sadness it looked like a weight to carry. "Officer," he started, voice wavering with a frown on his lips and water welling in his eyes. I'll never be able to forget the way my heart physically squeezed in my chest at the way he sounded, the way his body sagged. The loss was in his face. I don't know if this helps any, but she told me she remembers a man watching her before that night. His voice was soft, but his words sounded so loud in my ear. I took out my notepad and pen, clicking it to get ready to write, and looked at him with my best sympathetic smile. "Go on, son. It helps. Anything you know is helpful." Jeffrey rested his elbows on the table as he looked down at the wood, playing with his fingers that I could tell he bit the fingernails off of until they were red and raw. I always told her to tell someone, since it was so weird. The guy looked old, she said, but she didn't know who he was. He had a tattoo on his arm of a red bleeding heart that was set on fire. She remembers since one day while she was at the store he was lifting something as he watched her, and his shirt fell down his arm to hang on his shoulder. She knew he was old since his hands were wrinkly and he always wore a hat, so she couldn't see his face. I wrote everything he said down. For a second I considered it being in the next town over, but then when he mentioned the hat, it could still be open to being a local. She didn't tell anyone, he continued, voice shaking more as he talked. His voice sounded dry until he cleared it and swallowed, tears down his face now. Who could she tell, really? The police can't do anything unless it's a threat. Her parents are never around, and I told my parents, but they couldn't do anything either. I regret not being there that night so much, officer. I'm sure you know she had universities looking for her to come to their school. She never accepted one. She waited for me to be accepted into Berkeley so we could get out of here together. We were going to get married. I can't help but think if I were with her that night, she would still be here. His voice broke into sobs some time ago when he spoke. I held his shoulder as I scooted into the booth next to him, hugging the smaller boy into my chest. I already wanted to bring these girls to justice, but none of the family ever broke down to me about it. They would excuse themselves to cry, and I'd just leave from there and bid them my best. Jeffrey cried to me, against my chest as I told him countlessly that it wasn't his fault. I wanted to bring them to justice even more, like the torch had been turned into a bonfire in my chest. The police station was busier than ever in that hot summer month. It was no different when I walked in the next morning, after I took Jeffrey home, and spoke to his mother to keep an eye on him, with my notepad in hand to the brim with new information. I called a meeting for the entire station to attend. I shared what Jeffrey told me, watching some of the faces screw up in confusion, while some had a knowing look on their face of who I could be talking about. But yet they didn't say anything until the end when I dismissed the meeting. A rookie on the force came forward to me after, nervously messing with his uniform. "Sir, I don't want to put the wrong person behind bars, and I don't think anyone does. The only person I can recall with a tattoo like that is Mackie. Mackie, a 40-year-old man who lived on the outskirts of town, who was known for his never-ending cornfields and scarecrows. Scarecrows during Halloween and harvesting season were popular. and he always made a killing with them. I wasn't hesitant like the rest of my team who would rather drop dead than drive out to just talk to Mackie. In fact, I scolded a few of them before I left for not fessing up to their theories, and that 5 missing girls was more important than a scarecrow or corn. I drove out there by myself, hoping that maybe they were right, and Jeffrey could get the justice he deserved. I could only think of that kid, torn up like that. The town talks a lot, and apparently he skipped work to stare at a prom picture, crying to himself while clutching the photo to his chest. I felt a personal responsibility to alleviate that guilt, that if he had been there, it would have been different. I needed him to know that this was carefully planned by someone, that she put up a fight before she was taken. Mackie's cornrows started just a mile outside of town, and continued for 5 miles more until the road met a dirt one, with gravel sprinkled across the asphalt, with mud tracks on the road. It never rained enough here to clean off the mud that came from watering the cornrows, so it always felt like the asphalt was permanently stained. My car vibrated as it traveled down the dirt path, bumping every now and then as it came across a few hitches. But eventually I reached the red rickety house with a red farmhouse next to it. The sound of chickens and the smell of cow manure greeting me as I exited the car. The house was chipped of its paint in most spots. The stairs leading onto the porch creaked with each step I took, and the porch felt like it was going to give out from under me at any minute. I stepped to the screen door that the screen was halfway off of, pulling it open to knock my knuckles against the peeling wooden door. I should have called ahead to make sure Mackie was there, but by some stroke of luck, after a second set of knocks, the man came hobbling towards the front door and opened it up to me. Mackie already had all his gray hairs. He aged miserably since he spent his entire life in the sun, and his skin always looked like leather. Wrinkled leather. "Good afternoon, sir. Do you mind me asking to see your biceps? I'm trying to solve a case, and we're looking for someone with a specific birthmark that seemed to be shaped like a crab." I lied through my teeth. People in this community can't know their suspects. They feel betrayed. And judging by the questionable look on Mackie's face, he thought he was one. "Are you suspecting me?" His voice was thick with tension, but I faked a laugh and shook my head. "No, sir. Just a procedure we've asked everybody in town." Mackie eyed me up and down before picking his shirt up. I felt my breath catch in my throat when I saw the tattoo, but I forced a smile, nodding and thanking him for his time before stepping off the property to hop in my car and called a dispatch to get a warrant. I remember the grueling process it was to get a warrant. We called Jeffrey to the station to bring up the text messages from when Corrine brought up the tattoo. It was debated over in court until we had the right of way to get the warrant. This time people in the station were more on board to check out the property, so I had a team with me when I went back. The house was empty, not a single sign of evidence, and the cornfields would take so much searching. I need a bigger team, and that required money the force didn't have. The whole case seemed so frustrated, but there was something about Mackie that gave me the creeps. The way he watched us the entire time we searched the house, or when we would talk outside about searching the fields amongst ourselves. How he'd watch us from behind the screen door. He also had a hunch to his back. The tattoo matched. It seemed like it was him, and it wasn't because there was no other leads, but it felt like when you know, you just know. I'm sure that's a horrible thing for a cop to say, but my gut feeling never led me wrong. I'm sure some of you know what I mean, but for me to lead an investigation based on that would be incorrect. I never told anybody I had a gut feeling once I looked Mackie in the eyes. They'd never trust me again. We came back a week later with a bigger team of volunteers. It was a risky move to bring volunteers into this, but the entire town was in an uproar that we didn't solve this yet. People wanted to help. I overheard so many people call out from work just to be here, or small local businesses closed to be there and assist in the search. We split the 5 miles up in different sections. My team and I took the sheds. The sheds were different ones. One was a normal one for farming materials, but the other one was meant for Mackie's scarecrows. Inside it smelled like mildew and bleach. I couldn't possibly think of why Mackie would need bleach for a scarecrow, but I couldn't jump to that conclusion yet. The light in the shed was too dingy to make out anything, making us use a flashlight to inspect the surface that seemed way too clean. I felt the anxious butterflies churn in my stomach, leading us to walk out of the shed and down the cornfield rows. Nothing looked off. It looked like a normal cornfield, but yet something felt so off to me. I kept thinking of that shed, what Jeffrey said. Everything felt so right in my guts that I felt like I had to pursue this and finish this off. The answer lied somewhere, and it couldn't be in a tattoo and strong bleach smell, but somewhere it had to be something. Maybe it was the cornfields, but we walked and searched it until we got more towards the heart of it, where it was quieter. Mackie always said the crows flocked to where it was quieter. The search groups all reached the heart, looking around it. It was so hot. I was sweating underneath my uniform. The sky was blue, beautiful. The sun beating down on us even though it was starting to set. It was serene almost if you ignored the fact that we were looking for 5 missing girls. But it was then I noticed the smell. I turned to the officer on my right, sniffing the air, and watched his face curl in confusion. "Don't you smell that?" It smelled like something was rotting, like rotted meat was left out too long from the fridge during the defrosting period. Maybe also like rotten eggs. To this day, I can't ever identify the smell to relate it to anybody else. I followed the smell until it got stronger, accompanied by the buzzing of flies to lead me directly to a scarecrow. The leg looked too real. It looked so realistic but pale at the same time. Mackie's scarecrows have never looked realistic. Maybe a little scary in the art on their faces, with the evil grin for the kids, but never like this. I tilted my head back to scan the body, seeing it untouched until the chest that was slashed down to the stomach, bloodstain on the ground beneath it, as organs threatened to fall out from the cavities, with flies buzzing in and out of the body. Her green eyes were falling out of the sockets, slashes in her face as her nose hung from the septum, and jaw dislocated like a snake when it goes to swallow something whole. Her hair shoved in her mouth, as a nest of flies seemed to be stuck in the hair that was caked in blood in her mouth. I still knew who she was. Corinne always had so many freckles on her face that even if she was still dismembered, I could tell it was her. All 5 of them were there. I never told Jeffrey what I saw, and I hope he never finds this post. I told Jeffrey that it was a murder, but I never told him that his girlfriend he planned to marry was nailed against a wooden post, with staples through her hands, that had dried and crusted blood. How could I tell him that? How could I tell him his girlfriend was nearly unrecognizable? Lips cut off and teeth pulled, head half shaved. Her heart was missing from her chest, along with a lung. Jeffrey cried though, as if he knew the truth that Corinne was used as a scarecrow. Pinned up to rot and decay in the heat, absolutely mutilated and unrecognizable. I sit here in this diner more than my own home. I think about this too often, that I had to come here and write about it. I sometimes visit Mackie. I finally asked why he did it, and he said it was because his scarecrows weren't scary enough for the crows anymore, and he needed new models. He also said that the girls were something unobtainable, for someone gross and old like him, and he wanted to strike back to show that yes, he could get them. I think about that a lot, as I watch people. People do think they're unobtainable, living such a safe and protected life that I help keep safe and protected with my own hands. I know these people's lives better than my own, and yet my mind roams to Jeffrey and the grief he felt. I can't help but feel the underlying curiosity of what it'd be like to make a scarecrow of my own.
Number 1. Discovery. This really is the scariest thing that ever happened to me. I've waited a while to tell this story because for the longest time I tried to not even think of it. But I think I've reached a point where I can actually tell someone else. This happened a few years ago. I got interested in the idea of exploring abandoned buildings by watching people on YouTube do it. I didn't want to start a channel or anything like that. I just wanted to have some fun and hope that I would find something interesting. When I originally started out, it was pretty mundane. I mean, I got to some buildings and looked around. I guess some of the junk that was left behind was somewhat interesting, but not really. Anyway, that changed when I decided to check out an old office building and factory that had been closed down since the 1980s. I wasn't really sure why it was never demolished. I sort of always think about that when I see these old and scraggly buildings. No one does anything with them anymore, so it doesn't really make sense to me why they just sit there for years and years and decades. The office building wasn't easy to get to. The area around it was overgrown with vegetation. No one really seemed to take care of it very well. But I was able to muddle through and even found what seemed to be a path. I thought that perhaps other people have been exploring too, and maybe that is why there seemed to be a path there. For a moment I was worried about the possibility of running into someone, but I tried not to let that bother me too much. When I got to the building, it was much like the other buildings I had explored. This one was more interesting to me though. It was farther out, and harder to get to than the other ones had been. And this lent it an air of mystique or something. I'm not sure, but I really was much more apprehensive and interested in exploring it than I had been the others. Getting into the building from a broken window, I set about exploring the office building part. It was creepy because there were still cubicles, old desks, and things like that. I sort of thought that maybe when the factory closed, they would have taken those things with them and sold them or something. But there were tons of old furniture, which now had become useless from sitting in an old building for so long. I honestly didn't find anything more interesting than that in the office building, so I thought I would head over to the factory part of the building and see what was up there. At least if they had left behind so much furniture and stuff, it was likely they may have left behind factory machinery or something, and that would be very interesting. I made my way through the office building, trying to find a way to the factory side of the building. When I finally did, I was actually stunned when I thought I heard voices coming from inside the factory. I wasn't sure if I was right or not, so I tried to listen a little bit more. When I did, I was absolutely sure. There were voices coming from in there. At first I panicked. I thought maybe the people who owned the old building were there and they would find me. What would happen then? Would I get in trouble for trespassing? I wasn't sure. I tried to stay out of sight. I ran into a room with cubicles that had a wall facing the front of the factory. I peeked up through the window, trying to see if anyone was coming or going. There were no vehicles in front of the factory, so I figured the people who were there must have walked like I had. It took quite a while. I'm not even sure how long, but soon I watched 5 guys leave through the front of the factory door. They walked through the parking lot and eventually disappeared from my sight. My heart was pounding. I was both excited and a bit terrified, but I was also relieved that they had gone and had not found me. But that also got me thinking, what were the men doing in the factory? They hadn't taken anything with them when they left, so they weren't scavenging. Maybe they were using the factory as some sort of free storage. My curiosity was piquing, and it was getting the better of me. I decided I wanted to go into the factory and maybe find out if anything interesting was there. Hell, maybe they were drug dealers and stashed money in there. The buildings were connected, so I didn't have to go outside to get to the factory. I found my way to the entrance and was able to get inside quite easily. The factory itself was very interesting, as I had originally thought. There was lots of old equipment in it, but what really got me was how huge it was. It was one big, enormous room. I began exploring it, expecting to find drugs or money. I quickly made my way over to the area by the front door and began searching for it. I looked around behind all the equipment and everything. I was disappointed that at first I did not find anything. However, eventually I did find a door. It was a door to a small office. It was also locked, but I was prepared for that. It was an old door and took nothing more than a credit card for me to get into it. When I opened it and went in, I froze in terror and shock. I'm not exactly sure how long I stood in the office, shocked, before I ran out of it towards the factory entrance. I couldn't manage to hold it in, and I ended up throwing up before I got to the door. When I was done, I opened the door a little to make sure no one was out there. Then I opened it and left the factory. It had been at least an hour since those men had left. However, after what I had seen in the office, I was not going to take any chances that I might accidentally run into them. So I did not take the path that I had taken before. I took a much more difficult way out of the area. I was scared the entire way, thinking I would be caught, but thankfully I made it home safely. So, I know you want to know what I'd seen in the office. Well, I'm sure most of you have already figured it out though. There were dead animals in the room. Many different kinds, squirrels, rabbits, birds, and many others. And they weren't just dead, they were mutilated. I mean, some had their heads cut off, some had their limbs cut off, and although some of them were fresh, making me think they were killed by the 5 men that day, there were also animals that had been there for a while and were decayed. Oh God, I'm sorry I cannot finish explaining it. I'm about to barf again. So I'm sorry I can't give you more information than that. And no, I did not report it to the police. I have never told anyone about it before now. I couldn't bring myself to utter the words in any way until now. I had to have someone else type it up for me. Just be careful when exploring. Don't let your curiosity lead you down a wrong path. Number 2. Playland. First off, I want to let you know that this story happened in the 1980s. So I'm aging myself by telling you that. I was 13 years old, and I was the type of kid who was just bored by about everything. I didn't have a cool video game system. I think Nintendo was available at the time, but I don't know for sure. There was ColecoVision and Television, Atari 5200. I, however, only had an Atari 2600, and I was bored of it. Me and my buddy Clay began going out and trying to find things to have fun with. He wanted to do some more douchey things, like stealing mail out of people's mailboxes, but I wasn't that much of a dick to do something like that. I mean, I wanted to do something that was a bit dangerous or something, but I didn't want to accidentally steal some old woman's social security check or something. After a bit, we finally found a good idea. We lived in a neighborhood that once you left it, there was this big field where sports were normally played. Behind the field, there was also a fence that blocked off what I guess was a marsh. You were not supposed to, under any circumstances, go over that gate into the marsh. There were signs posted all over the fence, forbidding people from trespassing and threatening prosecution. Well, Clay and I decided to go over the fence and explore what was on the other side. It wasn't that hard for us to get over the fence. It was fall, and the only sport played was football, and that was only on Friday, so the big field was empty. We made our way through, easily made it over the fence and into the marsh. And we found that the marsh really wasn't a marsh, it was just a forest. So that was a bit of a relief, as that made it easier to walk through. So we went exploring. There wasn't really too much to really get excited about behind that fence. I mean, there was the slight thrill of doing something illegal, but other than that, not much. It was just an unkempt forest. That is, until we came to a clearing and there was a building in the clearing. It was clearly abandoned. There was no way anyone could have come there on a regular basis through that forest. Plus it looked like crap. However, it did have a sign that indicated it was called Playland. We had never heard of it before, but both Clay and I were anxious to find out exactly what Playland was. So we went up to the door and we were surprised to find out that not only was it unlocked, but it was easy to open. Going inside, we immediately realized what it was. It was one of those Chuck E. Cheese or Showbiz Pizza type places. They had those games in it where you could play and get tickets and trade them in for prizes. There was skee ball and basketball throwing games and all sorts of that sort of stuff. Since it was like Chuck E. Cheese, we figured there might be a room with animatronic figures that sing. So we went looking for it. We got to some big heavy doors and opened them. We walked in on about 10 guys and gals, punk rocker types, sitting around doing drugs. Their eyes were open on us immediately as we came in. One guy who was kind of skinny but scary looking. I recall he had on a leather jacket that was pierced with all sorts of metal decorations, and a red mohawk and several facial piercings. Jumped up. He got up quick and came over to me. He pulled a switchblade and pushed me up against the wall. Clay tried to protest in my defense, but it was stupid of him to have tried that. Another one of the punks grabbed him.
"What the fuck are you doing here?" he asked us. "Did someone send you here?"
I was scared and blubbering. I'm not afraid to admit that. I told him that my friends and I were just out exploring and came across the building. We didn't know that anyone was inside. One of the female punks called, "He's lying, Crank. Just go ahead and gut him." The punk holding me, who I assumed was Crank, flipped the knife in his hand. He lowered it down to my crotch and not my stomach. He stuck the point on my jeans where I guess you could tell there was a slight bulge, although I was so scared I was surprised it didn't just shrink up to nothing, and pressed it against me. "If you're lying, you can guess what I'll do to you." I swore I wasn't lying. I was crying hard at this point, and I guess that made Crank believe me. "If you tell anyone, and I mean anyone, about what you saw here, I'll find you," Crank said, his face not even an inch away from my face. "And I'll cut off all of this." He swirled the tip of the knife around my entire crotch. I swore I wouldn't tell a soul, and I really meant it. I guess he could tell I was sincere, and he took me and kicked me through the door, where I momentarily landed on my butt. I was on my feet in seconds and running to the door. Clay was quickly caught up with me. We got out of Playland and didn't stop running until we had cleared the marsh, the fence, and the field. I mentioned that Crank believed I was sincere when I said I wouldn't tell anyone. I meant it at the time. I have never told anyone until now, and all of my junk truly hopes Crank is not a Killer Orange Cat fan. Number 3. Shack. This didn't start out as an adventure to find an abandoned building. This was just a hiking trip, really. But it ended up with us finding an abandoned building and some pretty disturbing discoveries, too. You first have to understand that my grandma had my dad when she was very young. And then he had a kid, me, when he was very young. Around the same time that I was born, my grandma was only in her mid-30s. She had another child in that time, who was only a year older than me. So he was technically my uncle. However, I didn't see him as an uncle, and we were a lot more like brothers. So when this happened, I was 14, and my uncle Jason had just turned 15. Jason and I set off into the woods around my grandma's house one morning just to go hiking. We tended to do this quite often. There was a lot of country in that area that gave us vast areas to explore. We usually would begin early in the morning in order to cover as much ground as possible. Now, I'm not going to try and describe everything we did just to make this story longer. I'm sure you know that we were hiking through the woods, up and down hills, and we were doing it for quite a while. And it was in the late afternoon when we found this cabin or shack or something like that out in the woods. Of course, being the ages that we were, our curiosity made it impossible for us not to go in and check it out. Going inside, it was obvious that the cabin was abandoned, even more obvious than it had been from seeing it outside. There was nothing in it that was necessary for a person to live. There was no furniture at all. There were no appliances, not even rustic ones. And unlike most rickety old buildings you might find out in the woods, there wasn't much of anything inside it. But after a little looking around, we did find a little metal box in the one closet in the place. And it was that metal box that made us wish that we had minded our own business and never went into the shack to begin with. The box was full of pictures. They were pictures of kids, and while the majority of the pictures were fine, as we flipped through them, there were pictures of kids that we wished that we hadn't seen. There were some pictures of kids in their underwear, and there were some pictures of kids in even less than that. And in those pictures, the kids were obviously unhappy, and some were obviously crying. We weren't really sure what we had stumbled upon, but it was obvious these pictures were very old. We brought the box back to the house to give to our parents, just in case there was something that needed to be done about it. Like if whoever took those pictures was still on the loose. They turned them into the sheriff's office, and really never mentioned them again to either of us. We were teenagers at the time, but those pictures really freaked us out. They really made us wonder how easily it may have been for someone to have done something like that to us when we were younger. It wasn't an idea we cared to have. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. Thanks for your patience with this. I know that I was doing this last night and was having problems with my voice. I guess it was my allergies. There's a lot of pollen in the air. I thought there was something wrong with Audacity because my voice was sounding like it was slowed down, but I guess it was just my voice. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to hit the subscribe button and the bell below. Or wait for the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of the closing. Leave me a comment to let me know what you thought of the video, and share it with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please send it to the address included in the description. But as usual, and most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.